So last week we dove into 2nd Nephi 28, and we're going to look just at a couple things of that again to refresh memory of some of that stuff. We didn't look at everything, tried to peel back some layers of some significance of some of these scriptures in here and find some meaning that maybe we haven't seen there before. The big take-home message of all of Nephi, and actually what we're going to expand now and talk about the Book of Mormon, but the big take-home message that we talked about was how Nephi wrote 1st and 2nd Nephi later on in his life all at once, so to speak. I mean, obviously it took him a lot of time, but meaning he was writing one message. 1st and 2nd Nephi is really one big message, and he weaves in it, mostly in 1st Nephi, he weaves in it a little bit of the story of what's going on with him and his family, but the majority of that story was in the large plates of Nephi, the lost 116 pages, so on and so forth. So this 1st and 2nd Nephi was the replacement, and this was one big message about the gospel of Jesus Christ, the doctrine of Christ, which we hinted at last time, saying that we were going to dive into that as these lectures go on in the series. And this chapter 28 is kind of right at the end as he's wrapping up his whole big message. 1st and 2nd Nephi, one big message. And it's this message of Nephi's experience ascending into the presence of God, having the same vision his father had while in God's presence, really learning and coming to understand deeply the doctrine of Christ, which he ends with a recap. If we're not careful, we'll think that that's the first time he talks about it. He's actually teaching it all 1st and 2nd Nephi, but he recaps it all in those last couple of chapters, saying, I just need to say a few more words concerning the doctrine of Christ, boom, 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 and we'll be diving into that here soon after we go through some of these warnings and stuff. So we're trying to paying attention to these larger messages of the Book of Mormon and what they're trying to tell us, so that as we dive into little sermons here and there about the doctrine of Christ and repentance, etc., we are keeping in mind the message of this whole book. And so starting with Nephi's little book of 1st and 2nd Nephi, it's his message of he had this vision, he ascended to the presence of God. He's trying to teach us about that, while at the same time teach us, the Gentiles that have God's word. We talked about that, the reference of Gentiles. Teach us about what he saw, because he sees the end of the world. He sees our time right now. And of course, ever since Joseph Smith brought the Book of Mormon forth through the Restoration, the message has been, they saw our day, in all these 150, 160, 170, 180 years. But here's the part of Nephi and the Book of Mormon at large that we're going to consider tonight. That yes, it was for our day in that grand sense, but most specifically, as we see the language like of 2nd Nephi 28 that we talked about last time, and all of 1st and 2nd Nephi, and then eventually the entirety of the Book of Mormon. So not just Nephi's message, but the whole message of the book, is that it's a message for the final days. So, and that's what the last days actually means. We may have quasi-corrupted that phrase over the past 180 years, calling the last 180 years since the Restoration the last days. And while that is generally true, scripturally speaking, the last days refers to that little time period at the very end. And that's Isaiah's vision of the last days, or meaning the end time scenario, when the tribulations start and all this crazy stuff starts. And that was what we were focusing on in 2nd Nephi 28. That Nephi seeing this day, at that day. What day is that? It's the day of the Lord, the day of judgment of the Lord. This is important because as we try and take not just Nephi's 1st and 2nd Nephi in context to understand what he's really trying to teach us, and we dived into some of that last time, we can also appreciate this idea in the Book of Mormon when Mormon says, and then Moroni says, and even Nephi says, only 100th part. And even then, it's really not even 100th part. Sometimes they say not even 100th part. And sometimes they say only 100th part. And it's not about the math. It's just about the fact that they're trying to say it's the tiniest piece of everything that happened that we could give you. And why is that significant? So listen to the suggestion and consider it, because I think it really is helpful in understanding the Book of Mormon. In understanding these men were inspired what to write, but it wasn't this consider the likelihood and possibility that it wasn't this, I don't know why I'm including this in the Book of Mormon, per se. I mean, Nephi was like, I was inspired to make these small plates, right? And we know why, and Nephi said he didn't know why. I'm not talking about that kind of decision. I'm talking about, why was this story included, and why did he talk about this? That kind of decision, consider this, the likelihood, they chose the pieces of their history that they saw in the final days. What do I mean by that? The things that happen in the final days, in the end time scenario, what Isaiah prophesied, Nephi saw it in vision. We talked about how the angel stopped him from writing the rest of the vision, and so what did he do? He just started quoting Isaiah to give us the rest of his vision. We talked about that last week. And it's good to just kind of remind that if that's what's going on. And then Mormon is compiling little pieces from the Nephite history for us, and he's choosing things that he sees in these very final days and how it applies and how it's going to help us. And then Moroni gets a turn, and he doesn't think he's really going to get a turn. He and we're going to see that right now. He wraps up Mormon's portion, the Book of Mormon, inside the Book of Mormon, and he wraps it up in the last 2 chapters, and he thinks he's done, and then he realizes he got extra life given to him, so he does the Book of Ether, and then he does the Book of Moroni. And what did he choose to include? Same idea, stuff that they saw in the final days. These men had visions of the end from the beginning, just like Isaiah did, just like John the Revelator did. And these men were inspired. They saw what happened, and they saw what in their history happened that would repeat. And that's the pattern of scriptures, is types and shadows. Things that happened before will happen again. And even if you read something and it applied in the restoration of the gospel times and it was fulfilled prophecy, we looked at an example last time at the very end. Chapter 29 of 2 Nephi is a good example. And welcome, Amanda. At the end of the lecture, 2 Nephi 29 was a great example because it's a literal prophecy of what would start happening from the time of Joseph Smith all the way through now. And anyone that served a mission definitely has had that opportunity to have someone say, hey, I don't need that Book of Mormon. We already got a Bible. But we peeled back that layer of meaning to say, well, he's kind of speaking in this ancient Hebrew prophet style, just like Isaiah, where he's giving a very direct prophecy, but underneath it, it has an application for the end times, the final days. And he's seeing that, and he preps us for it in the previous verses, and then he jumps into 29 of this prophecy. And if we read it too superficially, we think that he's totally shifted gears when we get to 29, because now he's talking about the coming forth of the Book of Mormon, when he's really talking about the coming forth of more of God's truth. So this is a little bit of review of last week, while also a little bit of some additional insight to prepare us to appreciate not just what we're going through tonight, but any future study of the Book of Mormon, especially as we enter closer and closer to these final days and the things starting to play out. We can gain more wisdom from the Book of Mormon by realizing that the entire book is literally directed for events that would be in the final days. And so we can learn so much. We can learn the types and shadows, things to expect to happen, instructions to handle those types of scenarios, all the while learning about the clear and plain and precious truths of the doctrine of Christ that's in all the pages. So that is a beautiful mystery that kind of was hidden till now. We have to realize right now the heavens are open. They're open more than they've been since the days of Joseph Smith. And it's for these final days. And if you haven't realized that yet, then that's exactly what this series is for. And it's the Wake Up series. Last week was Nephi's warning to wake up. Tonight's Moroni's warning to wake up. There's a lot of warnings to wake up, and we only saw a small part. And I said, you guys are going to have to spend time on your own because it's really important that you do. But hopefully with this, you're going to start to realize if you haven't been paying attention, things are starting to happen. It's starting to come. And it can be kind of scary. It can be kind of intimidating, especially if you haven't prepared. You know, God says clearly in the Doctrine and Covenants, if you're prepared, you shall not fear. Well, that's just an eternal natural truth. God didn't even need to tell us that. It's the obvious. But he's reminding us as we need to be reminded. So while there's still time, even though it's at the doors right now, you can feel it in the air, there's still time. And that's one reason why I really felt moved upon by the Spirit to start doing this series. And it will get deeper and deeper as we get deeper into the series.